Well, good evening, everybody. It's Denis McClean here again with the third episode of our series of webcasts from GLAS. It's very strange to be here looking into the eye of my computer without a live audience in front of us, but I think a lot of you appreciate the fact that GLAS continues to try and engage with its audience during this difficult period for all of us. So I invite you to make a cup of tea, pour a glass of wine, and relax, because we've got a very interesting guest for you tonight, and his name is James Shapiro. He's a renowned author and professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University in New York. He also serves on the board of directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company and is the Shakespeare Scholar in Residence at the Public Theatre in New York. He is one of the world's most renowned Shakespeare scholars, but he wears that learning very lightly by producing some very readable books for the general public. They are beautifully written and exhilarating to read. They include 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, and Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare. He also edited the comprehensive Shakespeare in America anthology. Critics have been falling over themselves with praise for his latest book, Shakespeare in a Divided America: What His Plays Tell Us About Our Past and Future. And I suppose they tell us a lot about the present as well, and the various culture wars that still rage in America and elsewhere. So welcome to GLAS, Jim.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here with you and to be with your audience in these troubled times.
Indeed. How are things in New York? We hope you and your family are safe during this time of COVID-19.
Well, it's sad to say that it's a good day in New York when fewer than 500 people die every day here, and I would say it's fairly grim. I take a short stroll while masked outside every afternoon, and I live a few blocks from a major hospital, and there's a large refrigerator truck parked outside that hospital, which is a kind of memento mori, as my fellow New Yorkers who pass away from COVID-19 are stacked inside of it. So it's grim, and it probably will be grim for a few months to come at the least.
Do you find much consolation in reading Shakespeare these times? Is he relevant to you in your situation there in New York?
I do, although the Shakespeare that I like tends to be fairly dark. And it's odd to say that I take consolation in that beautiful lyric in that late play, Cymbeline, "Fear no more the heat of the sun," which is a sad and somber lyric, but it resonates for me right now.
We actually have had a couple of questions by email already, Jim, in response to our announcement of your appearance tonight. And there's one here from Kieran Leonard. I think he's in Dublin. It says, how did Shakespeare cope with plague? It does come up quite often in his work, but as far as I can recall, nobody actually dies of the plague in Shakespeare.
Yeah, you're right, and it's a very good question from Leonard. No one dies of the plague in any Elizabethan play. People are beheaded, drowned, mutilated in various ways. But because plague was so great a threat in a certain way, it was taboo to introduce it fully into a play. So a play like Ben Jonson's The Alchemist in 1611 is just about the only play set explicitly in plague time. And the reason for that is during Shakespeare's creative lifetime in 1593 and a decade later in 1603, terrible, terrible outbreaks of plague hit London. And in the first one, 1 out of every 7 Londoners died. And in the second one, 1 out of every 5 Londoners died. And that plague that struck in 1603 would return, what we now speak of that second wave, would return pretty much every year until 1610. So a great deal of what Shakespeare wrote, especially in the second half of his writing career, was either written in the aftermath of an outbreak of plague, during an intermission, or in anticipation, if you will, of its return. And I have to say, I've known that, and I've written about it a little bit, about when I wrote a chapter on plague in a book about Shakespeare in the year 1606. But everything about it now reads with a much greater immediacy and pressure.
Absolutely. You know, in preparation for this, Jim, I decided I should start reading a bit of Shakespeare myself. So I read Othello the other night. And apart from Shakespeare's wisdom, I mean, what struck me about it was how much that language still exists in our daily, in our vernacular, you know, wear your heart on your sleeve, led by the nose, etc. But I suppose what for Europeans, what we would find surprising about your book is the relevance that Shakespeare has for you in terms of the world of politics and world of culture in contemporary America. And you write that how Shakespeare won over America in the early 19th century is something of a mystery. So what light have you been able to shed on that mystery in the course of your research and writing this book?
Well, if you step back and looked at American culture in the early 19th century and realized that we had gone to war with Britain to break with it, the last thing you would expect is for us to adopt as our own national poet the national poet of the country we had been at war with in 1776 and then again in 1812. But America really didn't have an established body of writers at that time, certainly not on the level of Shakespeare. And for complicated reasons that remain somewhat mysterious, he entered into the cultural bloodstream, if you will, of America. People who had little access to education, such as President Abraham Lincoln, still had a book that included excerpts of Shakespeare, which he committed to memory in his log cabin on the prairie. Whatever plays were being staged in major cities like New York and in the South especially, were often Shakespeare. And the language of the Bible, the these and thous of Elizabethan English that fed into Shakespeare's plays, and the language of the King James Bible were very similar, so that Shakespeare became, in a way, a kind of secular scripture for America and has been appreciated, taught, loved, staged across the cultural divide. That is, those on the political right have embraced Shakespeare as dearly as those on the political left.
Well, good moment then to drop in this question, I guess. Do you think, this is from Org Rooney, do you think that America's Puritan legacy means that Shakespeare and literature in general always has to play second fiddle to God and morality in America?
That's a wonderful question. And it was the observation of Europeans visiting the United States in the 19th century that Americans always seemed to have a copy of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible in their homes. So I don't think it's one or the other. I do think when you move from what's being read to what's being staged, the story changes a little bit. Certainly in the more puritanical North in New England, there was a strong anti-theatrical tradition. And for New Englanders, Emily Dickinson, Emerson, others, Shakespeare was preferable on the page as opposed to on the stage. But in the South, it was not the same way. And America was settled both in Massachusetts and in Virginia. And the Southern states embraced Shakespeare much more theatrically than the Northern ones did. So we live in a strangely fractured country, and even the play you were recently reading, Othello,
Yeah.
landed in very different ways in the North, especially before the Civil War when slavery was dividing the country, and in the southern states.
So in this era of Black Lives Matter, what does Othello and the various attempts to stage it tell us about the state of race relations in America during the 19th century and to the present day?
It's a radioactive play. Othello lands differently in America than it does in Europe, in Britain, in Ireland. And I'll try to explain how and why. The first great African-American actor of Shakespeare, a man named Ira Aldridge, was not allowed to play Othello in the United States, emigrated to England, and then spent the next 30 years touring through Europe, playing Shakespearean roles, including Othello. Over a century would pass before Paul Robeson, another great African-American actor, could play Othello on Broadway. So the whole question of how Othello was acted has been and continues to be a very, very heated question. And whether white actors today should be allowed to play this Black role is a subject of real tension. I've not seen a white Othello in the last 30 years of playgoing. So who gets to play what role, whether Othello is represented as a heroic figure or, as T.S. Eliot once put it, as a man merely trying to cheer himself up at the end of the play, far less noble, is contested. And another way of speaking about how it has landed in the United States is in the South, before the Civil War, it was one of the most popular plays. But Othello was played by actors who were not fully Black, but darkened skin. We call this the Bronze Age of Othellos in the South. And as soon as the Civil War ended, so did the tradition of staging Othello. So if you want to know what racial attitudes are in America in any given place and in any given time, better to go to a production of Othello and take a read on the crowd than to read anything in the newspapers or interview people, because no American that I've ever met will admit to harboring racist attitudes, but racism pervades this country. And Shakespeare allows us access into what Americans think, but really are uncomfortable expressing.
One of the more unusual attempts to stage Othello was it during the Civil War with famous American general playing the part of Desdemona.
Yeah, that was one of the more remarkable things that I had a chance to investigate in the book. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1845, America was really faced with a choice. Did it want to remain a small republic, or did it want to become an empire? And the motto for the pro-imperial America became manifest destiny. We are blessed by God to conquer this continent from coast to coast. And what that meant was Americans should feel free to invade Texas and drive out Mexicans who owned Texas, that was part of their nation, and to go to the Pacific Northwest and drive out the British who had a foothold there as well. And we went and did that. And on the eve of the invasion of Mexico, the United States sent half of the army, the United States Army, to the Mexican border to provoke a war with Mexico so that we could invade. And the troops there, while waiting for orders to invade, were drinking and fighting and getting into trouble. So their officers decided, let's build a theater and put on plays. And one of the first plays they put on was Othello, which is in many ways a good choice. It's a military play, but it's also a play about a Black man and a white woman who is in love with him. And the soldiers cast about and they found a talented officer to play the Moor, the black officer, in the play. And then they had to find in an all-male community another actor to play Desdemona. And the first one they chose was a man who was about 2 meters tall and a football player, and he was just wrong for the woman's part. And they looked about and they found the man who was of slighter build and shorter and not so heavily bearded. And it turned out that he looked great in a dress, as they said. And he was the future 18th president of the United States and the hero of the Northern forces in the Civil War, his name Ulysses S. Grant. So to me, when I reflect back on my strange nation's history, to think of a future president wearing a dress, in love with a black man, and seeing the world through that perspective is one of the more hopeful moments in national history here.
That's a fantastic story. Did he wear a dress to his inauguration?
He did not. If you pick up an American $50 bill, you'll see Ulysses S. Grant, grizzled and jowly, staring back at you. But everyone said at the time he had a kind of girlish quality, and again, that he did look great in a dress. They wouldn't let him perform it. There was enough male anxiety among the actors that the actor playing Othello, who would be killed and his body lost a month later in a skirmish, he just refused. Maybe in the scene in which the two kiss in Cyprus was too much for him. So they ended up sending to New Orleans for a professional actress to come in and play the role of Desdemona.
And we have a question here from Sarah Toole, who's here in Geneva. She says, can you ask James to tell us about how he was introduced to Shakespeare, and if there was a game-changing moment, and if yes, would he share it with us? I mean, that's a question that struck me as well, Jim. I mean, you grew up in Brooklyn. How does a kid from Brooklyn suddenly develop a passion for Shakespeare?
He doesn't. He hates Shakespeare. He goes to public school, and he is force-fed Romeo and Juliet. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't even get the dirty bits that my classmates seemed to get. And I hated Shakespeare, and I made myself a promise not to study him. And when I went to university, swore off ever taking a formal course on Shakespeare, and I've never studied Shakespeare formally. What happened was, back in the late 1970s, it was possible to fly from New York to Europe for $99 at that time. And my brother and I, my brother's a few years older, would fly over and get Interrail passes and travel through Europe. And our travels led us to London. And we didn't have a lot of money. We were sleeping in church basements or youth hostels. And for less than $1 a day, you could go to see a play. And we started seeing Shakespeare plays. And even more than my brother, I was hooked. And every summer, I would hold down some job as a street messenger or selling trinkets in New York for 2 or 3 months, and then fly to London in August and see 30 plays in 30 days. Wow. And when you're young, you're really open to theater and to the arts. And these plays just washed over me. And after 5 or 6 years of doing this in my late teens and early 20s, I had tattooed really inside my skull 200, 250 productions of Shakespeare. And I could tell you how they unfolded with greater accuracy than I could tell you what I had for breakfast this morning. So my knowledge, my experience of Shakespeare was in the theater and remains in the theater. And although I'm a professor of Shakespeare and all those nice things you said about me in the introduction, I'm really, I've never acted. My thick Brooklyn accent would prevent me from doing that. And I have no interest in directing, but I am a theater goer. And in the last 10 years of my life, I've been invited into rehearsal rooms by the Royal Shakespeare Company, by the Public Theater in New York, and other companies on both sides of the Atlantic, the Globe in London. And I get to share my understanding of these plays without telling the actors and directors what the plays are about. I don't know what they're about. They're really reflections of the moment in which they are staged. So
Jim, if you don't know what they're about, there's not much hope for the rest of us. There's a question here following up on your story there about Desdemona. Are there any dresses left over in the costume cupboard for President Trump? And what role would you cast him in?
Well, I can give a two-part answer to that. Shakespeare has mattered a great deal to almost every American president, from our first George Washington, who went to see Shakespeare, down through Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan, who could quote Shakespeare comfortably. And Donald Trump is probably the first, and I very much hope the last of America's presidents who seems never to have read Shakespeare or seen Shakespeare, or if he has, it has not penetrated, it's just washed off of him. And I could almost grade each president in terms of the greatness of that president by the extent to which they immerse themselves in Shakespeare.
How did Obama take to Shakespeare?
I was teaching at Columbia when Obama was a student, but
really?
I did a year teaching abroad then. Otherwise, I could have answered that question much more directly. But Obama reads Shakespeare and reads Shakespeare very seriously. At some point, I would really love to interview him. I compiled an anthology on Shakespeare in America, and President Bill Clinton wrote a really engaging forward to that book. He knows his Shakespeare, and he understands his own ambitions through a play like Macbeth. I would have loved to have interviewed Abraham Lincoln. Another earlier president, John Quincy Adams, was steeped in Shakespeare, sometimes in ways that I find problematic. But Shakespeare is a wonderful way at getting at the issues that have bedeviled America for 200 years, whether those are issues about political fractures, economic issues, social issues, the family, marriage, race, immigration, whichever way you turn, Shakespeare provides a way and a safe way of wrestling with the problems that don't seem to go away for America.
Just while you were talking about your how you developed your love of Shakespeare, a question came in there. What is the best Shakespeare production you have seen, or is it possible to say?
The answer I usually give is an evasive one, and that is the last production that I've worked on is the greatest, in order to stay on good terms with the directors and actors that I've recently worked with. But if I were to give an honest answer, I waited 3 days in a queue in London back in, I think, 1981 to see a production of Hamlet with Jonathan Pryce as Hamlet and The Ghost of Hamlet, directed by Richard Eyre. And I have never seen a more brilliant or powerful production in my life. And when Jonathan Pryce, who was playing Hamlet, began to speak his father's words, which were coming out of him as if his father was a kind of Dybbuk living within him, the entire audience levitated from their seats. And if you're lucky, you get to see 1 or 2 of those productions in the course of a lifetime.
Fantastic. I don't think you answered this question, and it's come back again from somebody else, from I think it's Mairead Maguire here in Geneva. She says, what role for Trump?
You know, I've been asked that on occasion, and you can tell that I evade that question. The closest I can get to answering it is the chapters that bookend my book on Shakespeare in a Divided America.
We come to that later. We
Okay.
keep that for
Then
later.
in that case, the marker I'll put down now is the role I would give for Trump is of Julius Caesar in Julius Caesar.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Macbeth is often referred to as the Scottish play because it has so much bad luck associated with it. Certainly had a lot of bad luck for Abraham Lincoln, given that he used to carry around, I believe, a little pocketbook of Macbeth with him when he was a young man, certainly. Can you tell us about that dark night of the soul that America went through with his assassination, and what role Shakespeare played in that?
In April of 1865, the Civil War, which had taken the lives of 700,000 soldiers, both in the North and South together, was at an end, coming to an end. And the nation had to move forward. And in April 1865, a leading Shakespeare actor named John Wilkes Booth, who came from a distinguished family of actors, his older brothers and his father were Shakespeare stars as well. John Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., stood up behind Abraham Lincoln in the president's box where he was watching a play, shot him in the head, leaped on stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always with tyrants, before darting out the back of the theater door. He was surrounded and killed by Union troops 2 weeks later. And the story I tell in the book is a Shakespeare story. Both men were consumed with Shakespeare. John Wilkes Booth as an actor, as a leading Shakespearean actor. And John Wilkes Booth read Macbeth as a story of a heroic individual who is willing to fight to the end, even when the cause is lost. And this part of Macbeth was so important to him that sometimes when he would tour smaller American towns and play the role of Macbeth, he just performed Act 5 so he could do the fight scene at the very end. Abraham Lincoln also, as you noted, loved Macbeth. And his Macbeth was a cerebral, guilt-ridden man who had blood on his hands. And Lincoln, who was a depressive, seriously suffering from depression, he felt the blood of 700,000 Americans on his hands since he was president during these war years. And he came back again and again to the guilt-ridden speeches in Macbeth. And he would read those speeches aloud to anyone who was in a room with him, and he would read them and talk about them for hours. And he, to my mind, understood Shakespeare in a depth that I think no other American has ever approached. And this is a man who had no formal education. I'm not talking about university or high school. He had, from his earliest years, really no education at all growing up on a farm in the prairie. So he was a man for whom Shakespeare became a kind of moral compass. And these two great lovers of Shakespeare, for different aspects of Shakespeare, collided, one assassinating the other. And with some degree of irony, when the United States had to come to terms with the assassination of a United States president, the first time this had occurred, they chose Macbeth, lines celebrating King Duncan, as the correct way to memorialize the fallen Abraham Lincoln.
Great story. Staying with Macbeth, Jim, you know, I come from Dublin and we take great pride in the riots that occurred when the Playboy of the Western World was first produced in Dublin, but nobody died. And I'm astonished to read this story that maybe as many as 30 people died in riots over productions of Macbeth in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The year was 1849, and it was May 1849. And there are quite a few young Irishmen involved in this story. And a British Shakespeare actor named William Macready was touring the United States. And he was performing what I would call a quite cerebral Macbeth, a thoughtful Macbeth, a Macbeth who was not aggressive, who felt a sense of responsibility and guilt towards the end of the play. And he embodied elitism at that time. And there was another Shakespearean, his arch enemy, an American named Forrest. And Forrest had felt that Macready's Hamlet, which he had seen and hissed in Edinburgh, was too effeminate, too fey. And he trailed Macready as he came back to America and would stage whatever Macready was staging across town at the same time. And his supporters and followers decided to pick a battle with the elite in New York City. And the site of that battle was the Astor Place Opera House, which showed both opera and theater at this time. The Astor Place Opera House was the first theater built in America that had a dress code that was designed for the rich, by the rich, to keep out everyone else. And until this time, 1849, Americans liked to imagine that we were a society that was not a class-ridden society. We had broken with Britain, where people were noble, where there was an aristocracy and a king. In America, the fantasy was we're all fundamentally equal. And this was no longer the case. Income inequality, which is such a problem today, was already becoming a serious problem in 1849. And at a production of Macbeth by Macready at the Astor Place Opera House, there was a protest that had somewhere between 10 and 24,000 protesters, many of whom were young Irishmen who were brought in and handed cobblestones to throw at the theater and to destroy the theater. And it created panic, and the theater was at risk of being destroyed. The militia was called out. The crowd didn't believe that the militia would ever fire on protesters, and they did. They killed about 30, including quite a few innocent bystanders, and hundreds were injured. It looked like a battlefield, and the next day the two sides were about to rejoin their battle over income inequality, over class, over Shakespeare in New York City. And in the end, there was no more bloodshed, and those who ran New York realized there are fundamental problems here that this fight over Macbeth has revealed, and we'll take measures to change things, to allow more of a safety valve. We'll create Central Park to allow people to have access to a place for strolling and entertainment and the like. And we'll reform how the police department works and various other agencies. So Shakespeare, in this instance, became a way for this city, my city, to recognize what had gone profoundly wrong and to make changes because of that.
Fascinating. So we have Central Park, thanks to Shakespeare.
We do.
The public theatre in Central Park.
That is a little bit of an irony. And the other irony is that the public theater's main offices and theaters are located right where the Astor Place theater was. It was torn down in the aftermath of these riots. But if you visit New York as a tourist, you won't feel the fault lines in the city. We speak of California with its earthquakes having fault lines, but New York City has its fault lines as well, areas in which the rich and the poor butt up against each other. And the Astor Place Theater in the current Greenwich Village is one of those fault lines between the East Village, which is more radical and hip, and the more moneyed classes in the West Village. So there's a Starbucks coffee shop now where the Astor Place riots were, and protesters have fought out their battles in front of that. And Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had owned, when he married Trump's daughter, a multi-million-dollar flat in the Astor Place site. So it remains one of those contested sites in my country.
Well, we note that Trump has passed yet another ban on immigration, and that brings us to 1916, which was the tercentenary of Shakespeare's death. And how did America go about marking that occasion?
There were two ways in which Shakespeare played into immigration in the United States. The first way that had begun in 1895 was an effort by a Massachusetts senator, Henry Cabot Lodge, to insist that we needed to stop immigration because immigration of Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews, Lithuanians, was diluting the Anglo-Saxon nature of America. And America had been founded as a home for people fleeing persecution, religious persecution, political persecution, and it had opened its doors to everyone, including in the aftermath of the famine, tens of thousands of famished Irish men and women, including, I'm married to, my wife has an Irish passport, my son has an Irish passport. I'm not unaware of the Irish legacy in American history. But a decision was made to change who was admitted into America 130 years ago. An admission would no longer be open based on who you were. We didn't admit criminals then, so it was based on character, but it was not based on race or national origins. And Henry Cabot Lodge wanted to change that in order to increase, much as Trump sees the world, through an Anglo-Saxon vision. So, for example, in February, when Trump first decided to impose a travel ban, he first did it on China, and then he chose to do it on Europeans, but not the English or Irish. And this mirrors the exclusionary anti-Asian policies of the late 19th, early 20th century, followed by European, but not English or Irish immigrants. So we're watching, and I'm watching all this play out again. In 1916, those who wanted to exclude immigrants or take those immigrants who had come from overseas and force them into an Anglo-Saxon model, thought Shakespeare would be a wonderful stick to beat them with. Force them to read Shakespeare, study Shakespeare, acclimate them to this kind of America. And there was a very large-scale production, first in New York and then in Boston, of a play called Caliban. Caliban by the Yellow Sands, by a now forgotten playwright named Percy MacKay. Thousands of actors, all drawn from natives of New York, and tens of thousands of spectators came to see this. And although its intention was pro-immigrant, in the end, by telling a story about Caliban, who cannot assimilate, who simply is a potential rapist and threat all the time, showed how difficult it was to accommodate a melting pot, multicultural America. So Shakespeare really figured then, and in odd ways continues to figure every time one of his comedies is staged, in America's unresolved question about who really is an American, who should be allowed to live here, who should be considered a citizen.
Time for another question from our viewers. Sophie, I just have a first name. Superstition often crops up in Shakespeare's plays. Do you think this theme is as relevant today as it was in the Elizabethan era? Are we as superstitious today as we?
That's a very good question. probably one I haven't thought enough about. And I would say the whole notion of superstition is connected to what constitutes what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah.
So would it have been considered superstitious in Shakespeare's day to keep rosemaries and onions around you during the plague to protect you from that? That was knowledge, that was science, that was medicine. So superstition is a very, very complicated
Yeah.
question. And whether you're dealing with the witches in Macbeth or popular beliefs, we didn't yet live in Shakespeare's day in a scientific age. So various kinds of ways of imagining causality competed with each other, superstition included.
There's a lot of superstition about the use of hydroxychloroquine in America as an
Yeah,
alleged antidote to COVID-19.
and
Anyway, moving on,
and
Jim,
people died for that. So
yeah,
superstition is
can kill you.
can be very, very dangerous.
Yeah. Jim, no discussion about Shakespeare in America would be complete without focusing a bit on Hollywood. And, you know, there have been some famous Hollywood productions of linked to Shakespeare. I mean, Kiss Me Kate, Shakespeare in Love. What does that tell us about the influence of the Bard on
Hollywood,
American?
Hollywood has always tried to cash in on Shakespeare, and there's a wonderful website called Box Office Mojo, and it tells you exactly how much money each Shakespeare film ever made. And the only one that ever really turned a significant profit was Shakespeare in Love, because Americans were not keen on watching 3 hours of Shakespeare, whether it was in 1952 with Julius Caesar starring Marlon Brando, or the Kenneth Branagh films of more recent vintage. But Shakespeare in Love was a huge success. And that is a story I tell as well. And it was first imagined by a talented screenwriter named Mark Norman as a story about Shakespeare, who's married with a wife in Stratford-upon-Avon, who meets a young actor and falls in love with that actor and discovers that he, in fact, is a man in love with another man. And Hollywood decided at this time, when gay men or women were not allowed to serve in the military, during an AIDS crisis, during tremendous hostility to homosexuality in this country, that would never do. So they brought in the extraordinary playwright and screenwriter Tom Stoppard from Britain and had him rewrite the story. And as Stoppard noted, he got rid of the gay theme and made it a much more heterosexual story, but still had a fundamental problem with adultery. Shakespeare, we know, is married. Stoppard didn't want to change that fact. And the producer of this film was the now notorious, Harvey Weinstein, now imprisoned Harvey Weinstein, a man who is in prison for rape. And he was accused of sexually assaulting many women, including those who were involved in this production. And Harvey Weinstein kept wanting to change the end of this story. They couldn't figure out how to end Shakespeare in Love. And it went on to win 13 Academy Awards. So they figured out how to speak to America in a way Americans wanted. Harvey Weinstein wanted the character played by Gwyneth Paltrow, the cross-dressed heroine, to be a kind of mistress to Shakespeare. Shakespeare would give her roles and she would sleep with him on the side and he'd still be married. Basically recasting the story of Shakespeare in Love as the Harvey Weinstein story. And the director and the screenwriter resisted this happily and successfully. And I guess the story that I'm describing is yet another case of what's happening, if you will, behind the scenes in the creation of an adaptation of Shakespeare, whether it's this story or Kiss Me, Kate. Every time Shakespeare is adapted in America, it reveals something about American divisions, whether it's between men and women or over marriage or gay rights. And again, it's really difficult to understand what Americans truly think because we're not honest when we're asked about it. We're often not honest with ourselves when we ask ourselves these questions. But people will say things about Shakespeare that reveal the depth of their true feelings. And my job in this book was to go back and unearth that over the past 200 years so that I could understand, is Donald Trump an anomaly? Is this the problem of one man? Or are these problems baked into American culture, which is founded on the twin sins of slavery and the destruction of the Native American population that lived here when we first, as settlers, arrived?
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it? So let me come back to one of our viewers. This is a question from Nicholas Renton, who's watching us from London. Nick is asking, was Shakespeare a bit of a right-wing conservative? He invariably restored the status quo at the end of his plays.
That's a really good question. And I have to say, just being able to speak with you, with listeners in Geneva, with those in Ireland and in London and elsewhere, gives me a great sense of connection at a time when we're all socially isolated in this way. And I'm very grateful for everyone listening in and feel connected with you. That is a great question. And it's a question that American writers have struggled with and thinkers. The great American poet Walt Whitman couldn't accept the fact that Shakespeare seemed to be a monarchist and the restoring of the order at the ends of these plays. And all that is true, but there is at the same time a subversive quality to the ending of almost every Shakespeare play. Let me explain what I mean by that. And it really suits the American culture that these endings work in this way. Take the comedies, which we love and feel that heartwarming conclusion when they end in marriage and the reformation of a community. And yet again and again, the model of the formulation of that community at the end depends upon exclusion. And it goes back to what I was suggesting earlier in our conversation about immigration, that America defines who is American by who is left out. A play like The Merchant of Venice ends with excluding Shylock. Twelfth Night ends with excluding Malvolio. As You Like It ends with excluding Jaques. The Tempest ends with everyone sailing back and leaving Caliban alone on the island. So the community is defined by who is excluded as much as who is included.
Yeah.
The beauty of Shakespeare, to again land more directly on Nicholas's question, is those who are right-wing believe that Shakespeare is a defender of their values. And those who are left-wing are no less convinced that Shakespeare is a defender of their values. And that's the reason why Shakespeare is still funded in America and continues to survive and be part of a conversation, because he's one of the very few voices that we all accept and share.
Quick one here before we move on, from Pratik Bhatnagar, who's here in Geneva. What can you say about the popularity and influence and relevance of Shakespeare in non-English speaking countries? A lot of his characters were foreigners as well. How are they seen in these countries or by other ethnicities? Thanks.
It's remarkable to me the extent to which Shakespeare has been embraced internationally. And there are two ways to go with that statement. One is to say that he is universal because He's about love and truth and whatever other virtues you want to put into that category. I don't believe that for a minute. I believe that different nations, different cultures, different peoples find in Shakespeare, even as I have found in the American Shakespeare, something that speaks to them specifically. And I'll give you an example. In 1995, I was visiting Israel, and I had been a Fulbright professor there a few years earlier. I was returning to give some lectures, and there was a production of Merchant of Venice that was being staged in Israel at this time. And I went to see it. It was in Hebrew, but my Hebrew was good enough to follow it, and I know the play well. And it involved a Shylock who began the play as a kind of secular figure, but became radicalized in the course of the production when his daughter, Jessica, runs away with a Christian. And the mode of radicalization in that production was to have Shylock turn into a version of a West Bank settler and intolerant and violent. And a few months after I saw this production, about 200 meters from where this theater was, Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, who was pursuing peace, was assassinated by a right-wing settler who resembled that Shylock. And my takeaway from this experience was the Israelis were not staging Shakespeare because they were in love with Shakespeare, but because something in his works spoke to the subterranean tensions that were building and building and playing out in their nation and would soon be acted out. So Shakespeare becomes a way of seeing almost into the near future, because newspapers or the BBC, Radio International, will tell us what's happened. But Shakespeare helps us interpret what that means. And that's why 40 years after first being immersed in Shakespeare on stage, I continue to come back to him so that I can understand what's next for my nation and for other nations as well.
Thank you, Jim. That's a very thoughtful answer. I hope Pratik is happy with it. Finally, Jim, we return again, what seems to be a recurring theme of the evening, assassination. A Donald Trump lookalike played the part of Julius Caesar in a public theater production in New York. Did you seek permission to do it in the Trump Tower?
We did.
How involved were you in that production and the idea behind it?
I'm the Shakespeare scholar in residence at the Public Theater, which means that I consult and advise on productions. And the head of the Public Theater, Oscar Eustis, decided to direct this production himself of Julius Caesar. And he reached that decision a month after Donald Trump was elected. And at that time, which seems a really long time ago, it was unclear whether Donald Trump would embrace the middle, was merely campaigning as an intolerant, dictatorial, tyrannical figure. We didn't know yet, and we couldn't tell. And Eustis decided to restage this play with a Donald Trump lookalike with that long red tie and the suit and the blonde hair waved back, and with all the Trumpian mannerisms, and see what happened. And I should say, 2 years before that, when Barack Obama was president, another director, Rob Melrose, had done Julius Caesar with an Obama lookalike who was assassinated. So there's a tradition of this in American theatrical culture. But there were no protests when an Obama lookalike was assassinated on stage in New York and other places where that production was staged. And Eustis did something quite extraordinary with this production. He runs the Public Theater. He made it a modern dress production, and he put 50 actors throughout the audience who sat silently through the first half of the production until the moment when Julius Caesar is killed by Brutus and Cassius and the other conspirators, at which point in ones and twos, they stood up and started yelling and jeering and attacking the conspirators for having used undemocratic means to save democracy. And what Oscar Eustis was quite brilliantly trying to do was to create a sense of whiplash in his mostly liberal New York audience. Yes, we want to see the end of Trump, but what does it mean to do so violently? And it was a great question, and it could have opened up a really complicated conversation between the left and the right. But what happened instead was right-wing activists who have had an increasingly malign presence in my country in recent years decided to offer $1,000 to anyone who would sneak into the theater and disrupt that production. The actors started getting death threats. The director, his wife, and daughter receiving threats to their lives and bodies. The FBI was brought in, all kinds of park police were brought in, large security was brought in. And on night after night, towards the end of this run, with Fox News in a way cheering this movement on, protesters tried to disrupt this production and failed. But it became a heated moment in American culture, and my takeaway from it was a depressing one. The left wanted a conversation, thought there might be, and the right played to win. And they were offended that their guy, Trump, was symbolically assassinated in this play, and they were going to shut it down. They did not see this as art, and they were going to make Delta Airline take away its funding, which they did. And they were going to threaten any other theater in America, which many of them did, with warning them what would happen were they to trespass in this way. And when we've reached that point, the dialogue that has existed for centuries, 2 centuries in America, is worn thin. So I worry about the future of theater as a way of negotiating our divisions in America as we move forward. Certainly if Donald Trump wins and the forces who resort to violence are encouraged.
Jim, can you take just a couple more questions?
Happy to do so.
Thank you so much for your time. Question here from the International School in Basel, I believe. One of the faculty there, I can't quite make. For the first time in many years of teaching Romeo and Juliet, I find students saying Romeo is stalking Juliet by climbing her garden wall. How does political correctness help or hinder our teaching of Shakespeare?
That's a wonderful question. I admit that along with a greater awareness of the problems with authority that a previous generation or generations were comfortable with, comes with it a policing of Shakespeare that I, for one, think unfortunate. And there's not a character in Shakespeare who can withstand that kind of scrutiny. Far better, I would suggest, to think of Romeo and Juliet as existing in a moment of social distancing. Their families don't want them to come together, and they transcend that difference. And it's just easy to make Shakespeare say what you want him to say. So I'd be afraid of a new kind of puritanical reading of each Shakespeare character in turn. That would, I can do it as well as anyone. I could malign Romeo as much as anyone, but we're all creatures of our culture. Romeo and Juliet are bourgeois, middle-class kids. When Romeo sees Juliet, he says, "You're as beautiful as a jewel in an Ethiop's ear," a line that is both materialist and racist. Do I attack him for that? I don't. We're all trapped within the stories that shaped us. And young people especially should be allowed time to understand those stories and escape them. Romeo and Juliet died trying. So I would push back if I were the teacher of those students.
So just one last question, Jim. A question from Valerie Dunphy in Viewmount, County Waterford. She's asking, it's a measure of the man as a writer that everyone appropriates Shakespeare. Does anyone know what he himself really thought?
The only person who knew what Shakespeare really thought was Shakespeare. And he was wise enough not to tip his hand. We don't know what his politics are. We don't know what his sexual preferences are. We don't even know what his favorite snack food was. And that allows us both to project onto Shakespeare the values we want him to have, but also to allow us to read him in a kind of unbiased way. And I've always resisted trying to tell my students or my readers what Shakespeare thought. What Shakespeare did instead was to dramatize conflict. He saw competing views about marriage, about class, about politics, about race, about religion. And again, he drives these forces in opposition to each other. And we, 400 years later, are still wrestling with many of these divisions. And his plays are a wonderful resource for us to turn to again and again to measure the progress that we as individuals make in coming to terms with difference and the challenges our nations face in doing so. And I think that is something that he's going to continue to help us through in a post-pandemic age.
Well, Jim, your own books are a wonderful resource for us all to turn to rediscover the magic and wisdom of Shakespeare. And I would just like to give you a heartfelt thanks from all of us in the GLAS community for being so generous with your time this evening. And I would highly recommend not only your book, Shakespeare in the Divided America, but also your wonderful website, where people can find out a lot more about your output. And I hope that someday, not in the not too distant future, we can welcome you in person to one of our live events. It would be wonderful, Jim.
I look forward to that. You run an extraordinary organization. I hope many of those listening in will continue to support it generously. And my best wishes for your safety and well-being to anyone listening in.
Thank you, Jim, and stay safe and sane in New York in the coming months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much. That was great.